Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Here we go.
Yeah, we are jumping right into a massive, just a really heavy-hitting deep dive today for you. So here's the 30-second summary. We are exploring a fierce debate over the Old Testament God's commands regarding, well, genocide and slavery.
Right.
And then we are shifting gears entirely. We are going to apply a totally secular virtue scorecard to evaluate the actual moral machinery of Jesus and Muhammad.
It is a lot.
It is. We are looking at some incredibly heavy themes today. God, atheism, divine morality, and really the mechanics of how we measure ancient ethics against our own.
And I mean, the sources we have stacked up are just fascinating. On one hand, you have this very heated philosophical debate.
Yeah.
And on the other, a strictly structured, pragmatic breakdown of these massive religious frameworks. It really is a deep dive into the architecture of belief itself.
I'm so ready for this. But before we get into the weeds, just a quick housekeeping note for you listening. Yeah, got to get that out of the way. But seriously, we really need to set the ground rules for today's analysis before we go any further.
Yes, absolutely. This is crucial to establish right up front. Our mission today is purely analytical.
Totally impartial.
Exactly. We are completely impartial guides for you today. We are not taking sides, we aren't endorsing atheism, and we definitely aren't advocating for any specific religion or political worldview.
Right.
Our goal is simply to report on and unpack the fascinating and honestly sometimes uncomfortable arguments presented in today's source material. We are just looking at the mechanics of the arguments, nothing more.
So let's start with our first source.
Let's do it.
It's this incredibly intense debate between atheist Alex O'Connor and a Christian apologist. And the topic right at the center is the morality of God in the Old Testament.
A light, easy topic to start with.
Oh, totally. They are clashing over some incredibly brutal biblical accounts, specifically the slaughter of the Amalekites and the Canaanites in the city of Ai.
And the details from the text of Joshua that they dissect, they are stark.
Very stark.
When you look at the mechanics of the narrative in the city of Ai, the Israelite army chases the combatants out into the wilderness,
Right.
and they defeat them.
Right, the soldiers are gone.
Exactly. But then they are commanded to turn back to the city to deal with everyone who is left behind.
Which means they are going back for the non-combatants. The fighting men had either fled or were killed out in the field, so the people left in the city were the innocent women, the children, and the livestock.
Yeah.
And the text says they wiped them all out on God's direct instruction.
So Alex O'Connor's accusation here is that this isn't just a casualty of war.
Yeah.
He's saying it is undeniable, textbook genocide commanded directly by God.
And this is where the apologist offers a very specific defense. They argue that we really have to look at the historical and cultural context.
Okay, how so?
Well, the apologist's counter-argument is that divine revelation was entering a highly primitive, barbaric, ancient world.
Right. In this theological view, God wasn't just endorsing genocide in a vacuum. The argument is that God was actively trying to displace polytheism with monotheism.
In an era where brutality was basically the universal language.
Exactly. And the apologist makes a really aggressive point about the evolution of warfare to back that up.
Oh yeah, they point out that modern secular society doesn't really have much of a leg to stand on either.
That is a key pillar of their defense. The apologist claims that it was actually the later Christian tradition that eventually birthed what we call just war theory.
Which, for those unfamiliar, is the philosophical and legal framework that dictates the rules of engagement.
Right. Specifically the concept that slaughtering innocent women and children is a moral outrage. The apologist argues this concept grew out of Christian roots. And to contrast this, they point to modern secular warfare.
World War II, mainly.
Yeah, specifically the bombings of Dresden, Hamburg, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki.
The argument being that even in very recent enlightened history, the incineration of women and children was treated as the normal, acceptable course of war by secular nations.
Precisely. They even reference a documentary where a U.S. bomber pilot breaks down. He realized he was ordered to bomb a building filled with 20,000 women and children.
Wow.
But he followed the order anyway because he believed his side was the good guys. So the apologist uses this to say, human nature is inherently brutal.
And it's unfair to judge ancient texts by a modern standard that even modern nations violate.
Right.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Alex O'Connor's rebuttal to that defense is fierce.
He really is.
Alex argues that you absolutely cannot just hand-wave away an ancient genocide by pointing to a vague idea that Jesus came along centuries later to fix it.
Or by saying modern humans do bad things too.
Exactly. He points out that the ancient Israelites were directly instructed by the God of the universe to do things that we now consider objectively immoral.
Yeah.
If God commanded it then, it wasn't just a byproduct of a bad era, it was a divine mandate.
What's fascinating here is the apologists' response to that exact point. They argue that Alex is essentially standing on a Christian mountain to criticize Christianity.
The Christian mountain argument, yeah.
Meaning, the very moral intuition Alex is using to condemn the slaughter of the Amalekites, the apologist says that intuition was given to him by the centuries of Christian ethics that shaped Western civilization.
But Alex really pushes back on that.
Yeah.
He argues that even if a 1,000-year tradition of the church developed a better ethic later on, that came a bit too late for the Amalekites who were slaughtered.
Good point.
The core issue for him remains. God told people to abandon their human intuition and slaughter innocents.
This raises an important question, and it's really the crux of their whole debate.
What's that?
If God commanded something that seems intuitively immoral to us today, how do modern believers reconcile that?
Okay.
Do you view the ancient texts as a flawed historical record written by men trying to justify tribal warfare? Or do you view them as the harsh but necessary first steps of a divine plan in a brutal world?
It highlights a massive tension between human, intuitive morality and divine command.
It really does.
And that tension just gets stretched to the absolute breaking point when the debate shifts to the next major topic in the source, slavery.
Yes.
Specifically, the rules of slavery laid out in the Old Testament in Exodus chapter 21. When you get into the actual mechanics of what the text allows, it is jarring.
It is a very difficult text. Take Exodus 21. It outlines a system where a Hebrew male slave can go free after 7 years of service.
Which on the surface sounds somewhat like indentured servitude, like a temporary arrangement to pay off a debt.
It does sound like that, until you look at the specific clauses. The text states that if his master gave him a wife during those 7 years, and they had children, the wife and kids remain the master's property when the 7 years are up.
I want to pause you right there because the implication of that is wild. The man has to choose between his legal freedom and his own family.
Yes.
What happens if he refuses to leave them?
If he chooses to stay with his family, the text says he must submit to becoming a slave for life. His ear is pierced with an awl against a doorpost to permanently mark him as property.
It's brutal.
And remember, that complex system of temporary servitude and loopholes only applies to fellow Israelites. The text explicitly states that non-Israelites could be bought, sold, and bequeathed to children as permanent inheritable property.
Chattel slavery.
Exactly.
So the debate in our source then hinges on who is ultimately responsible for ending slavery, given that those texts exist.
Yes, and the apologist points straight toward Christian abolitionists.
Right.
They argue that it was Christians, specifically groups like the Quakers in the 1710s and 1720s, who drove the very first early anti-slavery movements, and they were reading the exact same Bible.
The same book.
To strengthen this point, the apologist contrasts the Quakers with the secular Enlightenment thinkers of the same era.
Philosophers like Immanuel Kant and Hegel.
Right, who are often heralded as the fathers of modern secular rationality. The apologist points out that they harbor deep, unprecedented racism in their writings that you actually don't find in the biblical texts.
It is a fascinating historical contrast. But Alex O'Connor counters with a really sharp argument about how those biblical texts were actually being used by the abolitionists.
Right.
He acknowledges that abolitionists, all the way up to figures like Martin Luther King Jr., used the biblical story of Exodus as their ultimate inspiration. God freeing the Israelites from slavery in Egypt.
The great liberation story.
Exactly. But, Alex argues, they had to selectively misread the text to do it.
By misread, he means they focused heavily on the liberation aspect, but completely ignored the immediate aftermath.
Right. Alex points out the irony that right after God frees the Israelites from Egypt, they march into the Promised Land and are commanded to slaughter and enslave the Canaanites already living there.
A huge contradiction.
He says if abolitionists had kept that part of the story in their sermons, the anti-slavery message completely falls apart. He also brings in the New Testament, noting that the Apostle Paul specifically instructed slaves to obey their earthly masters, even the cruel ones.
It is a prime example of how humanity has an incredible capacity to project its own morality onto static texts.
Confirmation bias on a grand scale.
Exactly. I mean, imagine for a second being on a plantation in the antebellum South. If you are there, where would a slave owner point in the Bible to justify their actions?
They would point to the explicit rules in Exodus or Paul's letters,
Right, and where would an abolitionist point?
the liberation of Egypt.
Yes. The apologist argues that Northern preachers used broad theological concepts, like everyone being created in the image of God, to argue against slavery.
Both sides are using the same book.
But their moral lens dictates which parts they emphasize and which they ignore.
So we have this massive historical tension about whether God's commands can be judged by human standards and how people interpret those ancient commands.
It's messy.
But what happens if we remove the divine element entirely? What if we look at the founders of these two massive religions, not as gods or prophets, but just as men operating moral machinery?
This is a great transition.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Our second source shifts the lens completely away from which religion is true to a pragmatic structural evaluation.
This source utilizes what it calls the Pangburn Virtue Scorecard.
A secular scorecard.
Completely secular. It's a framework designed to strip away the theology and just look at the mechanics of how figures like Jesus and Muhammad actually operate.
And it uses 6 specific virtues.
Yes. Fallibilism, well-being, communication, lightheartedness, patience, and inspiration.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, the source notes that inspiration in this context doesn't mean how inspiring they are to their millions of followers.
Right. It's not a popularity contest.
It specifically measures how inspired by art, beauty, and the natural world the figures themselves appeared to be in their teachings.
Exactly. So let's look at the evaluation of Jesus of Nazareth first. Overall, the scorecard gives Jesus a 7.1 out of 10.
That seems like a pretty solid score on a secular scale. What drives it up?
It's driven by some exceptionally high scores in specific areas. For instance, Jesus scores a 9 out of 10 on patience.
Wow, 9 out of 10.
This is because his framework teaches radical non-retaliation in human interactions. He introduces concepts like love your enemies and turning the other cheek.
That makes sense.
He also scores a 9 out of 10 on inspiration. The source highlights how frequently Jesus draws beautiful, observant metaphors from nature.
Like comparing the kingdom of heaven to a tiny mustard seed.
Or pointing out how the birds of the air don't sow or reap yet are provided for.
He also scores an 8.5 out of 10 on well-being.
Yes.
The source points out that he often prioritizes human flourishing over strict religious law. Like that famous moment where he heals on the Sabbath and says, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath."
In his lived everyday human interactions, the moral machinery is heavily focused on empathy and human flourishing.
Okay, so where are the lows?
The scorecard identifies significant structural lows. Jesus scores a 3.5 out of 10 on fallibilism.
Let's define fallibilism really quickly because that is a dense philosophical term.
It is. Fallibilism is the philosophical idea that absolute certainty is dangerous, and that a virtuous person should recognize their own cognitive limitations and remain open to new evidence.
Okay.
Jesus, according to this scorecard, is epistemically closed.
Meaning his framework doesn't allow for the possibility of outside truth.
Correct. He does not present himself as a truth seeker. He presents himself as the absolute truth, with statements like, "I am the way, the truth, and the life."
And the source argues that this leads directly into the major paradox of his entire score.
The catch?
Right. While Jesus is described as ethically gentle in his interpersonal teachings, the parables, the healing, he is also the figure who introduces the concept of eternal hellfire into the text.
The place where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. This is where the synthesis of these traits gets highly complicated. The source points out that this creates an infinite psychological cost.
How so?
Even though his daily communication is mostly through gentle parables, when you pair those parables with the threat of eternal, infinite punishment for getting the answer wrong, the dynamic changes entirely.
The source uses a brilliant phrase here. They say it becomes risk-managed submission.
Risk-managed submission.
I want to linger on that for a second.
Yeah.
The idea is that you aren't actually having a real conversation or a dialectic if one side holds the ultimate cosmic trump card.
Right.
If disagreement carries the threat of infinite punishment, it is no longer communication. It is coercion.
It is a profound psychological observation. So, how does Muhammad fare when subjected to this exact same secular scorecard?
The overall score from Muhammad comes in notably lower, at a 4.8 out of 10.
Okay.
And this is largely due to how the framework evaluates certainty and enforcement.
Let's break down those numbers, starting with the lows.
Sure.
Muhammad scores a 2.5 out of 10 on fallibilism. The source points out that in his framework, disagreement isn't viewed as uncertainty or a differing philosophical opinion.
What is it viewed as?
It is treated as literal disobedience to a divine command. The text explicitly says believers don't have a choice in an affair once Allah and his messenger have decided it.
There's also a low score on lightheartedness, coming in at a 3 out of 10.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair to both figures, neither Jesus nor Muhammad were exactly known for being stand-up comedians.
True.
But the scorecard maxims specifically value refining a sense of humor and not taking oneself too seriously. The source notes that in Muhammad's framework, mocking authority or the verses is treated as a severe moral failure, not just a joke.
However, to balance the evaluation, the scorecard highlights significant mid and high scores for Muhammad as well.
Like inspiration.
Yes, he scores a 7.5 out of 10 on inspiration. The Quran has a very strong recurring push towards seeking knowledge, observing the creation of the heavens and the earth, and understanding the natural world.
Right. There is a deep reverence for astronomy and learning embedded in the text.
On well-being, he gets a 6 out of 10. The source notes there is a very real concern for justice, charity, and mercy, famously stating that saving one life is like saving all of mankind.
But the framework notes that this well-being is strictly subordinate to divine command.
Yes, it's conditional on submission to the broader framework.
And then there is patience, which scores a 5.5 out of 10. The source uses an interesting term here, instrumental patience.
Instrumental patience, meaning patience isn't necessarily an inherent permanent state of being, but rather a tool used until a specific goal is met.
So there are commands to be patient and avoid conflict gracefully.
But the source notes those coexist alongside commands to fight until subjugation is achieved. Patience is employed strategically.
It is a completely different type of moral machinery than what we saw evaluated with Jesus.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the grand synthesis the source provides between the two figures is really illuminating.
How does it bring them together?
According to this secular scorecard, both frameworks demand absolute certainty. Neither is fallibilist. The major difference is simply where the coercion enters the picture.
Right. The source argues that Jesus is epistemically closed, but his coercion is cosmic and deferred to the afterlife.
It's infinite, but it happens later.
Muhammad, on the other hand, is certainty-driven and enforcement-capable, meaning the coercion and the consequences for disobedience are enacted right here in the physical world.
Deferred coercion versus enacted coercion.
So what does this all mean?
That is the big question.
We've covered ancient battles, the roots of abolition, the confirmation bias of how we read static texts, and a secular scorecard for the two most influential figures in human history. Why should you, the listener, care about how these arguments are mechanically constructed?
Exactly.
I think it's because whether you are prepping for a philosophical debate, analyzing world history, or just insanely curious about how humanity operates, understanding these sources gives you a decoder ring.
A decoder ring, I like that.
It shows us the invisible scaffolding beneath the foundational texts and beliefs of billions of people.
It forces us to look at how belief systems are constructed, rather than just reacting to the final building. And it leaves us with a profound question to consider as we wrap up.
What's the final thought?
If modern humans use their own intuition to judge ancient divine texts as either good or barbaric, does that mean our ethics have truly outgrown those ancient frameworks? Or are we just unconsciously coasting on the moral momentum those very religions set in motion centuries ago?
Wow. That is something heavy to chew on. Thanks for exploring the machinery of belief with us on this deep dive.